You walk into a room full of people laughing, talking, sharing stories about their weekends. And you smile, you nod at the right moments. You even laugh when the timing feels right. But somewhere deep inside, behind all of that performance, there is this quiet, hollow feeling. Like you're watching everything from behind glass. Like everyone else got the instructions to being human, and you somehow missed the delivery. You are not antisocial. You are not broken. You are not cold. You are just different. And you have known it for a very long time. Here is what no one tells you. The loneliness that intelligent people carry is not the loneliness of being unwanted. It is the loneliness of being misunderstood. And those are two completely different wounds. Part 1: The weight of a mind that never stops. There is a version of you that exists only in your own head. A version that is constantly thinking, analyzing, dissecting, questioning. A version that lies awake at 2 a.m. not because something is wrong, but because your mind found a thread it cannot let go of. Maybe it is a conversation from 3 days ago. Maybe it is a philosophical question about why people behave the way they do. Maybe it is something about the nature of time or consciousness, or the quiet sadness underneath modern life that no one seems to want to talk about. Most people, when their day is done, turn the volume down. They scroll. They watch something light. They decompress. But your mind does not have a volume knob. It has a dial that only goes one direction. And when everything around you is quiet, that is when it gets the loudest. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it hyperconnectivity of the prefrontal cortex. In simpler language, the part of your brain responsible for abstract thinking, pattern recognition, and deep analysis never fully powers down. It is always running background processes, always making connections, always searching for meaning in places most people never even look. And here is where the loneliness begins. Because meaning seeking is an isolating experience. When you are the kind of person who needs to understand the why behind everything, you quickly realize that most conversations never go that deep. Most people are satisfied with the surface, with what happened, not with what it means, with the event, not the emotional architecture underneath it. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, spent decades studying what he called the psychological types. He noticed something profound, that people who operate primarily from a world of internal depth, people who live inside ideas, inside meaning, inside the invisible layers of experience, often feel like strangers in a world that rewards surface fluency. He called this the introverted intuitive type. But you might just call it the feeling of never quite belonging anywhere you go. And it starts far earlier than you think. Part 2: Where this began. Think back. Not to adulthood, not to your teens. Go further back. Back to when you were a child. Do you remember being the kid who asked too many questions? Not the annoying kind of too many. The genuine kind. The why does the sky look different colors at sunset kind. The why do people say things they do not mean kind. The why does love sometimes make people cruel kind. You were curious in a way that made adults uncomfortable. Not because your questions were bad, but because the answers required a depth that most grown-ups had spent their entire lives carefully avoiding. And at some point, someone, a parent, a teacher, classmate, gave you a signal. Maybe it was subtle, maybe it was blunt, but the signal was clear. Tone it down. Be easier to be around. Do not make people think so hard. So you learned to perform. You learned to meet people where they were. You learned to translate your inner world into something more digestible. You built, in the language of Jungian psychology, persona, a social mask, a version of you that was calibrated for social survival, and you got very good at wearing it. But here's the tragedy of that mask. Every time you wore it, every time you chose accessibility over authenticity, every time you laughed at small talk when your soul was starving for depth, you widened the gap between who you were on the outside and who you were on the inside. That gap has a name. It is called alienation. And for intelligent people, it is not a phase. It is a chronic condition that begins in childhood and calcifies over time if you never learn to name it. The German existentialist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood this intimately. He wrote about the loneliness not as a flaw, but as an almost inevitable consequence of a mind that sees what others cannot or will not. He described it as the loneliness of the peak. The idea that the higher you climb in understanding, in perception, in depth of thought, the thinner the air becomes, and the fewer people are climbing alongside you. That is not arrogance. That is geography. Part 3. The invisible barrier. Here is something that will feel uncomfortably familiar. You have tried to connect. You have really tried. You have sat across from people at dinners and birthday parties and work events. You have asked questions, listened carefully, shown up with your full presence. And still, at the end of the night, you drove home feeling more alone than when you left. And then, you wondered what was wrong with you. But nothing was wrong with you. What you were experiencing was something psychologists call a depth mismatch. A fundamental incompatibility not in values, not in character, but in the level at which two people want to engage with reality. Think of it like a frequency. Every person operates on a certain frequency of depth. Some people are happiest in the shallow end, and that is completely valid. The shallow end is warm, comfortable, and full of easy laughter, but you are wired for the deep end. And no matter how hard you try to enjoy the shallow end, some part of you is always looking toward the horizon. The problem is not that shallow people are bad. The problem is that when a deep person and a shallow person try to have a genuine conversation, both walk away unsatisfied. The deep person feels unseen. The shallow person feels judged. And neither one is wrong. They are simply operating at different depths. But here is what makes this particularly painful for intelligent people. You are often perceptive enough to sense the mismatch immediately. Within minutes of meeting someone, you can tell whether a real conversation is possible. And when you sense that it is not, you do not disengage the way less perceptive people might. Instead, you perform. You code switch into a version of yourself that can operate at their level. And you do it so seamlessly that they never know. But you know. And the cost of that performance is enormous. Psychologists call this emotional labor. The invisible work of managing your own interiority while simultaneously navigating someone else's. For intelligent, highly sensitive people, this kind of labor is not occasional. It is constant. It is the background radiation of every social interaction, and it is exhausting in a way that is very hard to explain to someone who has never felt it, which, of course, only deepens the loneliness. Part 4. The paradox of being understood. Here is the paradox that sits at the center of this entire experience. Intelligent people crave deep connection more than almost anyone. They have rich, complex inner worlds. They feel things at a texture and depth that most people never access. They are capable of extraordinary intimacy, extraordinary loyalty, extraordinary love. And yet, they are statistically among the least likely to find the deep, reciprocal connection they are searching for. Why? Because the very depth that makes them capable of profound connection is also the thing that makes casual connection feel unbearable. And in a world that runs primarily on casual connection, that is a devastating trade-off. Think about what most social bonding actually is. Shared humor about surface-level things. Mutual complaints about traffic or weather or work. The comfortable warmth of familiarity without depth. These are the social glues that hold most communities together. And intelligent people can participate in all of that. They are often quite good at it, but it does not feed them. It is like eating food that has no nutritional value. You can consume an enormous amount of it and still feel starving. What feeds an intelligent person is something much rarer. A conversation where the other person is willing to be genuinely vulnerable, where the masks come off, where both people are willing to sit inside uncertainty, inside complexity, inside the uncomfortable truth that most of life does not have clean answers. Philosopher Martin Buber called this an I-thou relationship, as opposed to an I-it relationship. The difference is that in an I-thou encounter, two people meet each other as full, sovereign beings, not as roles, not as functions, not as social performances, but as actual people, in all their contradiction and depth. Intelligent people are almost constitutionally incapable of being satisfied with I-it relationships, and in a culture that has largely normalized and even celebrated the superficial, that makes them quietly, persistently hungry. Part 5. The shadow side. Now here is where we need to go somewhere a little darker, because there is a shadow side to this story that does not get talked about enough. Intelligent people are not just passive victims of loneliness. Sometimes, without realizing it, they are also its architects. Here's what that looks like from the inside. Because you have been disappointed by shallow connections so many times, you have developed a kind of preemptive armor. Before someone even has a chance to misunderstand you, you have already decided they will. You scan people quickly, identify what you perceive as their ceiling, and hold back accordingly. You self-censor. You keep the most alive parts of yourself carefully tucked away, available only in your journal, your imagination, your 2 a.m. thoughts. You tell yourself you are protecting yourself, and you are, but you are also preventing the very thing you are starving for. This is what psychologists call the intimacy avoidance paradox. It is the pattern where the people who most deeply need connection are also the most defended against it, because their previous experiences of vulnerability taught them that being truly seen is dangerous. That when you reveal the full complexity of who you are, people either cannot hold it, or they use it against you, or they simply walk away. And so the armor becomes permanent. It becomes part of the identity. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have buried because the world told us they were too much, too intense, too strange, too needy, too deep. For intelligent people, the shadow often contains their most extraordinary qualities. The curiosity that got shamed in childhood, the emotional depth that got labeled as sensitivity or weakness, the philosophical hunger that got dismissed as overthinking. And here is the terrible irony. The more you hide those parts, the more alone you feel, because the people in your life are not really seeing you. They are seeing the performance. And no matter how warmly they respond to the performance, it does not touch the part of you that is actually hungry. Connection through a mask is not connection. It is theater, and you can be surrounded by an audience every single day and still be completely, utterly alone. Part 6. The Misdiagnosis Society has a habit of misdiagnosing intelligent people, and those misdiagnoses follow them for decades. You were probably told, at some point, that you were too serious, that you needed to lighten up, that you were too intense, too much in your own head. And if you heard those things often enough, you eventually started to believe them. You internalized them as character flaws, as things to be fixed or softened. But here is what was actually happening. You were not too serious. You were serious about the right things in a culture that is uncomfortable with seriousness. You were not too sensitive. You were operating with a neurological and emotional bandwidth that most people simply do not have. You were not too much in your head. You were processing reality at a depth that takes time and inner space. The research on this is striking. Studies in cognitive psychology consistently show that people with higher levels of abstract reasoning tend to experience what researchers call existential depression at significantly higher rates. Not clinical depression in the traditional sense, but a specific kind of sadness that comes from perceiving the fragility, the randomness, and the profound difficulty of human existence with unusual clarity. In other words, the more clearly you see the world, the heavier it can feel. Psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski studied this extensively. He developed a framework he called the theory of positive disintegration, and at its center was the idea that certain kinds of people, what he called people with developmental potential, feel everything more intensely, more comprehensively, more permanently. He called these intensities overexcitabilities, and he described them not as disorders, but as indicators of a person who is built for a deeper, more complex experience of life. These people, Dabrowski observed, often go through periods of profound inner turbulence and loneliness, not because something is wrong with them, but because they are being built, through that very turbulence, into something extraordinary. The loneliness, in other words, is not a dead end. It is part of the becoming. Part 7. The loneliness that teaches. There is something that happens in the deepest kind of loneliness that does not happen anywhere else. You begin to know yourself. Not the performed version of yourself. Not the version that shows up to make other people comfortable. The actual, unmediated, unfiltered version. The one that exists in the absence of an audience. Most people never meet that version of themselves. They keep themselves surrounded, stimulated, busy, distracted. Because silence and solitude are uncomfortable. Because when the noise stops, the questions start. But you have spent a lot of time in that silence. And whether you knew it or not, that silence has been doing something to you. It has been refining you. It has been deepening the quality of your perception. It has been burning away the parts of you that were only ever there for performance or approval. And what gets left behind, when all of that burns away, is something rarer and more valuable than anything acquired through socialize. It is authenticity. It is depth. It is the kind of self-knowledge that most people spend their entire lives running from. The ancient Stoics had a term for this. They called it the inner citadel. The idea that the most secure, most sovereign place in the human experience is not a social position, not a relationship, not an achievement. It is the interior life, the life of the mind, the soul, the deeply examined self. For intelligent people, the loneliness is often the forced construction of that citadel. Every failed shallow connection, every dinner party that left you emptier than before, every relationship that never reached the depth you needed, was also a brick in that interior structure, was also one more reason to go deeper inside yourself, to take your own mind more seriously, to trust your own perception in when the world around you dismissed it. That is not nothing. That is the foundation of every great thinker, every real artist, every person who has ever contributed something genuinely new to the world. Rilke, the poet, understood this when he wrote about the necessity of living the questions. He was not offering comfort. He was describing a way of being that requires a tolerance for incompleteness, for uncertainty, for the vast, uncomfortable territory that exists beyond easy answers. That is where intelligent people live. Not by choice, always, but by nature. Let us get more specific. Because the loneliness of intelligent people is not a single thing. It has several distinct textures, several particular hungers, and understanding them is the beginning of finding what actually feeds them. The first hunger is intellectual intimacy. This is the need for someone who can meet you in the world of ideas. Not someone who knows a lot of facts, but someone who is genuinely alive inside a question. Someone who does not need the conversation to resolve into a clean conclusion. Someone who can hold complexity alongside you without the anxiety of ambiguity. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people need conversations to conclude. They need answers. They need the uncertainty to resolve. But for an intellectually hungry person, the best conversations are the ones that end with more questions than they started with. The ones that leave you slightly destabilized, slightly enlarged, slightly changed. Finding that in another person is one of the great joys of a deep life, and the absence of it is one of its great sufferings. The second hunger is emotional precision. Intelligent people often feel things with enormous nuance. They need to be able to describe emotional states with precision, with context, with the full complexity of what is actually happening inside them. And they need someone who can receive that precision without reducing it. Most people, when you try to describe something emotionally complex, will instinctively reach for the simple interpretation. They will try to name it, categorize it, solve it. They mean well, but what you actually needed was for them to just stay, to let the complexity exist without collapsing it. When you find someone who can do that, who can hold the full texture of your inner life, without flinching, without simplifying, without rushing toward resolution, that is not just friendship. That is a kind of homecoming. The third hunger is the permission to be strange. Because the truth is, you are a little strange. Not in a pathological way. In the way that all genuinely original minds are strange. You make connections that other people do not make. You find beauty in unexpected places. You grieve things that other people never even noticed to begin with. You care passionately about things that most people consider irrelevant. And you have spent a lot of your life apologizing for that, softening it, translating it into something more palatable. What you hunger for is a space where none of that translation is required, where you can be fully, unapologetically yourself without watching for the moment when the other person starts to look slightly uncomfortable, where your strangeness is not just tolerated but actually cherished as the most interesting thing about you. Here is where everything shifts. The story you have probably been telling yourself goes something like this. There is something about me that makes deep connection impossible. I am too much. I am too complicated. I am too intense. I will always be fundamentally alone in the way that matters most. And that story is not just wrong. It is the most self-defeating story an intelligent person can tell themselves. Because it takes what is actually your greatest capacity and turns it into evidence of your own deficiency. Let us reframe every single part of this. The fact that you are unsatisfied by shallow connection does not mean you are incapable of connection. It means your standard is high, and a high standard is not a defect. It is a form of self-respect. It is you refusing to betray the full depth of what you are capable of by settling for less. The fact that you feel lonely in crowds does not mean you are antisocial. It means you have a very specific kind of hunger that crowds cannot feed. And recognizing that specificity is enormously useful, because it tells you exactly where to look and exactly where not to waste your energy. The fact that you have spent years performing a version of yourself that is smaller than the real thing does not mean the real thing is unlovable. It means you have been hiding the most extraordinary part of yourself, and the people who would recognize and cherish that part have never had the chance to see it. The armor you built was rational. It made complete sense given what happened to you when you tried to show up fully. But the armor has a cost that has been quietly destroying you. And the cost is this. Every wall you built to keep the pain out also keeps the connection out. Every mask you learn to wear to make other people comfortable also makes you invisible. Psychologist Brené Brown spent decades studying what she called vulnerability and belonging, and what she found, consistently, was that the people who experienced the deepest connection in their lives were not the ones who had found the safest people first. They were the ones who had decided, despite all the evidence that it was dangerous, to show up as themselves first. Vulnerability before safety. Authenticity before certainty. Showing the full, complicated, hungry, strange, deep self before you know whether the other person can hold it. That is terrifying, especially for someone who has been burned before, especially for someone who learned very early that being fully themselves was a social liability. But it is also the only way through. Here's what no one tells you about the loneliness of intelligent people. When they do find connection, it hits differently. Because you have spent so much time in the absence of it, because you have such a precise understanding of what it is you have been searching for, when it arrives, you recognize it immediately. There is no confusion, no second guessing. You know the exact moment when a conversation stops being a performance and starts being an encounter. You know the exact feeling when someone says something that reaches past the mask and touches the actual you. You know the relief, the almost physical relief, of being understood by another person without having to first translate yourself. Most people who have lived comfortably in shallow connection, their whole lives never experience that specific relief, because you only feel the weight of something lifting when you have been carrying it long enough. The loneliness you have lived with, as brutal as it has been, has also calibrated you for something extraordinary. It has made you impossible to fool with counterfeit connection. It has made you incapable of settling for the merely comfortable when the genuinely real is possible. And the relationships that intelligent people build, when they build them, tend to be among the most profound and enduring that human beings are capable of. Because every person in those relationships knows exactly what they are getting. No performance, no translation, no comfortable distance. Just two people who have both been lonely in the deep way, recognizing each other across the room. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Now here is the part that most psychology videos rush toward. The fix. The 5 steps. The morning routine that solves the existential loneliness of a highly intelligent mind. But there is no fix. And pretending there is would be a betrayal of everything we have just explored. What there is instead is a different relationship with the loneliness itself. Because the loneliness is not separate from you. It is not a malfunction in an otherwise working system. It is part of the texture of being the kind of person you are. It is the shadow cast by the same mind that gives you your depth, your perception, your extraordinary capacity for meaning making. You cannot amputate the shadow without amputating the light. What you can do is stop treating the loneliness as evidence of your unworthiness. Stop interpreting it as proof that something is wrong with you. Start seeing it as something much closer to what it actually is, which is a sign of the scale of what you are built to hold. Empty vessels are never lonely. It is only the ones that contain something real, something complex, something alive, that feel the ache of not being fully seen or fully known. Your loneliness is proportional to your depth, which means it is also, if you let yourself see it this way, proportional to your capacity. The second thing is this: stop hiding the most alive parts of yourself to make other people comfortable. Not because you owe them your full self in every context, but because the version of you that never gets shown to anyone eventually starts to feel like it does not exist. You need to find, or create, spaces where the full version of you is not just permitted, but required. Spaces where you are expected to be complex, to be strange, to be alive in the way that most social environments ask you not to be. Those spaces might be a single friendship. They might be a creative practice. They might be a community built around the kind of ideas that actually electrify you. But they need to exist somewhere. Because a self that is permanently in hiding is a self that begins to suffocate. And the third thing is perhaps the most important. Learn to be genuinely, non-performatively at home in your own company, not as a coping mechanism, not as a consolation prize for failed connection, but as a real destination, as a place that is actually worth arriving at. Your inner world is not a waiting room for the connection that will finally make you whole. It is not a gap to be filled or a wound to be healed. It is a landscape, one of the most interesting, most complex, most genuinely alive landscapes you will ever have access to. And you have spent so long apologizing for it, hiding it, trying to compress it into something more socially manageable, that you may have forgotten just how extraordinary it actually is. It is time to stop apologizing. Final realization: the truth that changes everything here is the mental shift that this entire video has been building toward. You have been framing your loneliness as a problem to be solved, as a condition to be overcome, as the gap between where you are and where you want to be. But what if the loneliness is not the problem? What if the loneliness is the signal? A signal that you have not yet found the life, the people, the spaces that are actually built to hold the full scale of who you are. Not a signal that those things do not exist. Not a signal that you are incapable of finding them, but a directional signal, an orientation device. The loneliness is not telling you that you are broken. It is telling you that you are still searching. And the fact that you are still searching means the hunger is still alive. And the fact that the hunger is still alive means you have not made the most devastating mistake an intelligent person can make, which is to stop wanting what you actually want and settle for what is merely available. The most dangerous moment for a deeply intelligent, deeply feeling person is not the loneliness itself. It is the moment they decide to stop being lonely by becoming someone smaller, by shutting down the depth, by finally, successfully, permanently learning to be satisfied with the surface. That is when the real loss happens. Your loneliness is a form of loyalty. Loyalty to the full scale of what you are and what you need. And that loyalty, as painful as it has been to carry, is also the most honest thing about you. Nietzsche wrote, not in the clinical language of psychology, but in something closer to prophecy, that the lonely ones are those who are pregnant with the future, that the isolation is not a punishment but a gestation, that what grows inside the loneliness of an extraordinary mind is something the world has not yet seen. You are not lonely because you are broken. You are lonely because you are rare, and rare things take a long time to find their home, but they do find it, and when they do, the years of hunger make the arrival something that no one who never went without could ever fully understand. Which truth in this video landed the hardest for you? Was it the idea of connection through a mask not being real connection? Was it the reframe of loneliness as loyalty? Or was it the moment you recognized the armor you built and the cost it has been quietly charging you? Write it in the comments. Not because it will fix anything, but because naming a thing is the first step to no longer being owned by it. And in the next video, we are going to go somewhere even deeper. We are going to talk about why the most emotionally intelligent people are often the ones most likely to attract the wrong kind of love. And why that pattern is not a coincidence. It is a map, and it leads somewhere you have not expected.